All right, looks like this thing's working. Hello, everybody. My name's Peter Anderson. I'm one of the grad students, or the only grad student, I guess, in this money and possessions class. And so, one of my special assignments is I get to write an extra paper and give a little lecture on one of two subjects. Two subjects I'd pick from. I chose Paul's practice of tent making. It's something I've thought about before, lived through a little bit before, and thought it was interesting. So it's a good opportunity to look at the scriptures a little more closely and see what they have to say. So we'll see. We'll see how that all goes. I think it'll be interesting. Obviously, I've been stuck at home like most people. I'm sitting in my closet in my bedroom because get away from the kids. um, so I don't have a ton of extra biblical resources for this paper. I have a few commentaries here and things like that. But most of this will just be the text of Scripture and things that are available to everybody. Most of this, if you've read your Bible, if you've thought about this, most of this will be review. But I think when I was reading it, I found some things I hadn't noticed or emphases that I hadn't realized before. And so hopefully it's interesting for you. And kind of like Dr. Freeman always says, you can watch this at double speeds. It shouldn't take you too long. So without further ado, I will go into it and mostly be following my paper as for the content of this. So the Apostle Paul, at different times in his ministry, supported himself through tent making, something we all know about. But not only are we simply informed about this practice in Scripture, but Paul goes into quite a bit of detail about why he did this and things like that in his writings. So, considering this, a number of questions naturally arise. And if you've read your syllabus, obviously these questions are also in the syllabus. So, but I think they are the natural questions that you come to as you think about these things and try to apply them to our lives today. So, why does Paul choose to support himself through tent making? What theological, social, and pragmatic issues went into the choice? What advantages and disadvantages resulted from the choice? How does this choice relate to us today? And lastly, I'll make this personal and ask how Paul's example relates to my personal ministry goals. And I'll also say something about my history and experience in living out some of these things in my short time of ministry. So, my basic premise that I came to with this study is that we are not obligated to do exactly what Paul said. I think there's some passages that are very clear in that regard, but that there's much that we can learn from his example, and times when his example should be, our model for how we support ourselves in ministry. And throughout this study, that basic premise hasn't changed. That was what I came to with, and that's what I'm leaving it with as well. But I think there's a lot of details in there that would profit from looking at the scriptural texts on the subject. So, in order to answer these questions, well, I will begin by looking at the relevant scriptural passages for the subject. Obviously, there's more passages out there than the ones I selected, but I thought it flowed well, I thought it made sense, and I answered our major questions for this subject. So, I don't claim to have been fully exhaustive on the subject. Mostly it'll be from the New Testament and Paul's writings specifically. All quotes will be from the NASB, if that's important to you, because that's the Bible I use. But wait, before we look at the life of Paul, I think a little background is in order. So, in the Old Testament, there are a number of saints who supported themselves by normal means, either before or during their calling as people of God. We find shepherds, agriculturalists, kings, government officials. Some examples might be Abraham or David or Daniel, who all either pursued their spiritual calling while doing these other employments or in some other way was connected to that. So there's clearly nothing scripturally wrong with regular employment. But on the other hand, you have the Levites and the priests who were supported for their ministry. And I'm not going to pull up every scriptural passage because that will take forever. So I'm going to just pull up a few, though, just to keep us coming back to the Bible, because I think that's recommended. So Numbers 18. Hopefully you read Numbers regularly. I suggest reading it every year, not just in Bible survey, but that's a different conversation for a different lecture. Briefly, I'm just going to read chapter 18 from Numbers, verses 19 through 21. All the offerings of the holy gifts which the sons of Israel offered to the Lord, I have given to you and your sons and your daughters with you as perpetual allotment. It is an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord to you and your descendants with you. Then the Lord said to Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in their land or any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance amongst the sons of Israel. To the sons of Levi, behold, I have given all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance, in return for their service which they perform, the service of the tent of meeting. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. They were to be professional ministers, receiving their living from their ministry, pretty clearly. We've already looked at that passage in our conversations about the tithe, so it's something we should be familiar with. In Nehemiah, we have that we have a sign of spiritual backsliding is when the Levites had to support themselves through working in the fields, and it was something that Nehemiah rebuked the people for when they started doing that. So just very briefly, those are just a couple points from the Old Testament I think that are helpful. Moving to the New Testament, we find that Jesus was financially supported during his ministry. We see that in Luke 8, 1 through 3. There are a number of women who supported him out of their means. The 12 apostles were called from their regular employment to follow Jesus. Again, looking at Luke 5, 11 and 28. Except for the one lapse after the resurrection, but before Pentecost, which we read about in John 21, 1 through 11, we never find them supporting themselves through fishing or other forms of regular employment again. Now, I called that a lapse. That's how I read it and understand it in the context. You can disagree with that. We can talk about that sometime if you want. We find then that there is a pattern of ministers being supported for their ministry before Paul. I think this is important to keep in mind when we ask the question of whether or not Paul's practice of supporting himself through tent making is mandatory or not. Okay, I think it kind of shifts the burden of proof a little bit. The first passage specifically about Paul that I want to look at is Acts 18, 1 through 5. And that'll be the second passage I'm going to read briefly because it's kind of a good introduction to a lot of what we're going to get into. So, Acts 18, 1 through 5. After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, before Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But then Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. And I should probably drink more coffee so I don't mess up too much when I read. Maybe. I don't know. That seems to help Dr. Peterman, so maybe it'll help me too. So, context. We see that Paul left Athens, began his ministry in Corinth. Saw that in verse 1. There, Paul began what would be a fruitful ministry association with Priscilla and Aquila. We see them throughout the New Testament. They worked at the same trade as he, which was tent making, which could be translated, I think, a little bit, variety of ways, which Dr. Peterman talked about in his last lecture. So, see that. It was Paul's practice during that time to work at tent making and to preach on the Sabbath. See that in verse 4. Sorry. For historical and cultural context, I think it's helpful to note that later Jewish practice was for rabbis to earn their living by working a different trade. I quoted Craig Bloomberg on that, but I've also heard that in a number of other places. So it's possible that part of Paul's training before he came to Christ was learning the tent making trade. It is interesting that in the following verse 5, after Silas and Timothy joined him from Macedonia, it seems that Paul changed his practice. Since he stopped working at tent making and spent all of his time testifying about Jesus. Verse 5. It would appear that a financial foundation came from Macedonia that enabled Paul to devote all of his time to the ministry of preaching and teaching. I think it is also important to remember that Paul is working in a missionary or a church planting context in Corinth and not as a pastor of an established church. It's going to be an important theme, I think. The other passage in Acts that I want to look at briefly is chapter 20, verses 33 through 35. Paul's here speaking with the church elders from Ephesus. He states that far from extorting anyone, he had not even coveted anyone's wealth or possessions. In verse 33. Next, Paul says that through his own labor, he supported both himself and those who were with him. Verse 34. Paul is not praising himself in any way. Rather, he is telling these things as an example for them. Specifically, he emphasizes hard work, helping the weak, and that it is more blessed to give than to receive. Verse 35. So, briefly, summary of what we find in Acts, that is that Paul served as a missionary in a church planting context. Instead of receiving funds or support from the people he was ministering to, would rather either support himself through tent making or from gifts given by another church. Paul also, through his example, emphasizes the importance of not using spiritual authority for personal gain and the importance of hard work. Okay, so those are the themes that I see in Acts. Next passages, I'm kind of going chronological here through the biblical text. The next place we find an important section of teaching on Paul's practice of tent making is in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We have already been introduced to the church in Corinth in Acts 18. It was a church that Paul planted, and it was a church with a number of internal issues that Paul addressed in his letter to them. In 1 Corinthians 4, Paul contrasts the rich and proud condition of the Corinthians with the poor and suffering condition of the apostles, 4, 8 through 13. In this section, along with descriptions of material and financial hardship, Paul writes that we toil, working with our own hands, verse 12. It is clear from the context that at least Paul and his companions supported themselves, and there's a suggestion that the other apostles had the same practice, though that is less clear, and I haven't read a lot about that, but I think that'd be interesting to pursue more on. In chapter 9, Paul goes into so much more detail about his practice of supporting himself, and we could read the entire chapter, but just, again, pull out the Bible, be cool about that. Just going to read a few verses from that. And I think, for time, let's just read verses 8 through 14, kind of jumping in the middle of it here, and we'll look at it in a little more detail. I'm not speaking these things according to human judgment, am I? Or does not the law also say these things? For it is written in the law of Moses, it will not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. God is not concerned about oxen, is he? Or is he speaking altogether for our sakes? Yes, for our sake it was written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing the crops. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we do not use this right, but we endure all things, so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly at the altar have their share from the altar? So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. Then he goes on. Okay, so clearly the answer is yes, he had a right to do this. And that's kind of the point of that section. Paul gave the example of a soldier, owner of a vineyard, and the shepherd, who are all supported by their chosen profession in verse 7. Beyond this, there's the teaching of the law, which is implied in the muzzling of the ox, that a worker should receive remuneration, verses 8 through 10. Paul is clearly arguing that a minister of the gospel has the right to be supported for the ministry that he does. Verses 11 and 14. You see that in both those passages. That being said, that's not where the passage ends. The rest of the chapter kind of goes on. That being said, Paul asserts that he and his fellow ministers did not exercise this right when serving among the Corinthians. Verses 12 and 15. For Paul, preaching was not voluntary. He had to preach the gospel. He was compelled. In verses 16 and 17. He sees giving up his right for payment for ministry as a voluntary thing that he delights to do. Verses 15 and 18. Paul's heart in all of this is the spread of the gospel. Verses 19 through 23. In summary, then, we find that Paul and those who were with him had the regular practice of supporting themselves through their own labor, even though this was difficult and they suffered hardship for it. Also, we learn that gospel ministers have a right to be materially supported for their work, even in the missionary context, it seems. But Paul chose to voluntarily forego this right for the sake of the gospel. Okay, that's 1 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians. I know we're going kind of fast, but if you want, go back, reread the passages. It's worth the time. 2 Corinthians, the church had repented for many of the issues that Paul wrote so sharply against in his previous letter. Even so, Paul still feels the need to defend his actions among them, and that is where we find some relevant passages for our study. Paul describes his practice among them of preaching the gospel without charge as something that was humbling. In chapter 11, verse 7. He received support from other churches in order to do this, something he provocatively describes as robbing them, in verse 8. In all things, Paul did not want to burden them. Verse 9. Paul saw this refusal to be paid by those he was ministering to as a distinguishing mark between himself and false preachers, which he makes a big deal of in verses 12 through 15. He also briefly repeats this theme at the end of the book. In summary, 2 Corinthians, one of the distinguishing marks of Paul's ministry was that he would not receive pay from the people he was ministering to. Although this was humbling for Paul, he did not want to burden them in any way. Because of that, he would rather support himself or receive funds from other churches. Okay, so much for Corinthians. Both in Acts 18:5 and in 2 Corinthians 11:9, we learn that Paul received financial support from Macedonia. So, where did it come from? The church in Philippi. And it is to Paul's letter to the Philippians that we now turn. The church in Philippi was also a church that Paul planted. We see that in Acts 16. From the letter, it's clear that it was a much healthier church than the one in Corinth, and Paul had a strong relationship with them. For the subject of this paper, I'm only going to look at this lecture now, chapter 4, verses 10 through 19. Paul was in prison, and he would have needed support from his friends. The Philippians had not been able to send anything, it seems, for a little while, for whatever reason. See that in 4:10. Paul takes this as an opportunity to teach about contentment, verses 11 through 13, a wonderful section. Their gift and support was a way for them to share in Paul's affliction, verse 14. Verse 15 is particularly interesting. We learn that only the church in Philippi financially supported Paul. Therefore, they must be the church from Macedonia already mentioned in regards to supporting Paul in Corinth. Also notice that they did not support Paul while he was ministering among them. They only started supporting him as he went and ministered other places. So he didn't break that pattern that we already noticed with the Philippian church. This continues the theme we've already seen, right? In the next verse, we also find that Paul was supported when he ministered in Thessalonica, verse 16. Paul's then careful to emphasize the benefit the Philippians received from their giving over the benefit the gift provided for himself. Apparently their gift was a rich one, because Paul had an abundance. And their gift was more than a social or material thing. It was an acceptable sacrifice to God. Verse 18. Paul would not be able to pay them back for this gift, but he promises that God would supply their needs. This whole section, and this last verse especially, should be thought of in the ancient cultural context of social reciprocity, okay, which we've talked about quite a bit in class. This passage has a number of important insights and applications for those who support others in ministry. Not the subject of this paper, though. So, for our subject, in summary, though Paul was content to live in need, it was good for the Philippians to support him, and Paul would not receive pay from the people he was church planting among, but he had no problem receiving financial support from other churches when he wasn't there. Okay, as we saw in Philippians, the church in Philippi supported Paul while he ministers in Thessalonica, so let's turn to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And this will be the last passage I read, because we don't have a ton of time. Probably go a little over my time, but God is gracious, and I'm sure Dr. Peterman is too. So 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, just going to read a couple verses 9 through 12. For you recall, brethren, our labor and hardship, our working night and day, so as not to be a burden to any of you, we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and so is God, how devotedly and uprightly and blamelessly we behaved toward you believers, just as you know how we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would his own children, so that you would walk in a manner worthy of the God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Amen. So, chapter 2 opens up by Paul describing the humble way he served amongst them. Paul reminds them of the way he supported his own labor, supported himself in ministry. Verse 9, clearly it was difficult for Paul to both support himself through his labor and do ministry at the same time. So he has to work night and day, describes in verse 9. Something that's quite difficult, obviously. He is clear about his reasons, though, for doing this. He did not want to burden them, and he was willing to do this for the gospel. Chapter 2, verse 9. These same ideas are repeated in 2 Thessalonians 3:8. Paul worked hard hours to pay for his own food, so he would not be burdened to anyone. Just repeating it goes through the same things. Paul is also clear that he had a right to financial support if he chose to exercise that right, but he chose not to in order to provide an example for the Thessalonians to follow. 2 Thessalonians 3:9. I think from the context, this is a general instruction for the whole church and not specifically for ministers. Paul's very concerned about that some people are not working but live in undisciplined lives. Chapter 3, verse 10 and 11. Instead, they should work to provide for themselves and do good. Verses 12 and 13. In summary, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Paul had to work very hard to both support himself through his labor and be still effective in ministry. But it was worth it to him so that he would not burden the people he was ministering to and not hinder the spread of the gospel. He also thinks that his example of hard work is one that all Christians should follow. Okay, the last texts I want to look at are from the pastoral epistles. I think it makes sense if Paul wants this to be an ongoing practice for everyone to be supported through extra means, extra ministry means that he's going to talk about in the pastoral epistles. So I think it's relevant to look at those briefly. 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. So, 1st Timothy, there are a number of passages of interest, and I'll quickly look at a couple that I think are pertinent for our study. In the passage about the qualification for overseers, we are told they must be free from the love of money, 1 Timothy 3:3. The qualifications for deacons has a similar clause, which says they should be not fond of sordid gain, 3:8. In 5:17, we have an important statement that elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor. What does that mean? This is explained and supported by the following verse. Quote in the Old Testament, law of not muzzling an ox. Ooh, we've seen that before. And the statement that the laborer is worthy of his wages. Chapter 5:18. Now, I've heard this in sermons before, in the commentaries I read, all agree, commentaries I have in my house anyway. So, I cite 3, whatever, is what it is. That this double honor is speaking about ministers being financially supported. And this is significant for our topic because it makes it clear that Paul thought that regular ministers of the gospel in a local congregation should be financially supported for their work. In fact, those who teach should be doubly supported. So, very important for our subject. We'll talk about that a little more in the applications at the end. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, we have an important warning about those who think that godliness is a means of gain. 6:5, something we've also seen before, and that is financial gain. Paul follows this with several arguments supporting contentment and exposing the evils associated with the love of money. Verses 6 through 10. 2 Timothy, moving on there, chapter 2, verses 4 through 6, Paul instructs Timothy on how he should conduct himself in ministry, giving some examples for him to follow. Some of those examples in verse 5 and 6 seem to teach that elder or a minister should be supported by the local church for their work. Later, in a passage where Paul is worrying about how things will be in the last days, 2 Timothy 3:1, he writes these men will be lovers of money, in verse 2, along with other sins. Okay, so there's a few repeated themes that we've already noticed. Continuing on. And then Titus, the last book we'll look at very briefly. Paul again warns against sordid gain as one of the qualifications for ministers in Titus 1:7, 11. This was clearly an issue in the church, even at that early date, and is still a problem today. And there's nothing else in Titus that I could find about how an elder was supposed to support himself. So, in summary then, what we find in the pastorals is that though Paul supported himself through either tent making or gifts from other churches when working in a missionary context, for ministers serving in an established church, the congregations should substantially support them. That being said, ministers are strongly warned against covetousness and the love of money. Okay, so those are the relevant passages that I found, and time won't give us anything more to look at anything else, so we'll stop there with that and briefly try to answer some of those questions that were raised in the syllabus and at the beginning of the paper. And I'm going to go through each of these kind of quickly, but I think they're all helpful, and I think we already have some idea of what the answers are just from the text that we've looked at. So first, why did Paul support himself through tent making? We've seen a variety of reasons. Here are a few that I pulled together, and there's probably more. Paul wanted to distinguish himself from false teachers and prevent any accusation of ministering for personal gain. We saw that in Acts 20, 2 Corinthians 11. In other words, Paul wanted everyone to understand he was not in it for the money. Another reason, Paul also did not want to burden those he was ministering to. We saw that in 2 Corinthians and 1 Thessalonians. All of this was ultimately done with the heart that the gospel would spread more freely. We saw this in 1 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, and this practice also provided a helpful example for hard work for the church. Saw that in 2 Thessalonians. Next question is what theological, social, and pragmatic issues went into this choice. I'm just going to really quick look at this theological, social, and pragmatic in turn. Theologically, the mission of God, or at least is the good news of the gospel, that salvation is available in the Lord Jesus Christ to whomever will believe. Paul's great calling in life was the spread of the gospel, and he voluntarily gave up his right to financial support so the gospel could spread and not be hindered. Okay, so that's kind of a theological thing. Social issue that went along with Paul's choice, we've already talked about, is the issue of social reciprocity. We saw that in Philippians 4, and Paul answered this question by saying that God would take his place and give back to his supporters. So it's a social thing. Pragmatically, Paul's goal being to not be financially supported by the church he was ministering to, he accomplished this by two means. Primarily support himself through tent making, or secondarily through receiving financial support from churches, most likely only Philippi specifically. Okay, next question. What advantages and disadvantages resulted from this choice? So clearly Paul thought this was an advantageous arrangement, or he would not have practiced it. No doubt. And argued for it the way he did. I think he would have seen the advantages as being able to accomplish all of the goals enumerated already. I'm not going to repeat that. That being said, I think there's also a couple disadvantages that we see in the text quite clearly. For one, he had to work long hours night and day. So that in 1 Thessalonians, it would have been difficult and fatiguing. My own experience of doing this, I found it hard to give either my day job or my ministry my full attention or the ability to really do a good job at either. So it's a difficult thing. Second difficult thing is that, one more thing with that. I think we also noticed that it's not ideal from Acts 18 of where when they brought financial support, he stopped tent making. And so I think Paul found it as a more advantageous arrangement was to be supported by a different church while serving in a missionary or church planting context. I think he saw that as more ideal. I think we see that in Acts 18:5. But the other disadvantage was that some looked down on him for doing manual work. I think we specifically see that in Corinthians. So a couple disadvantages as well as numerous advantages that we already saw. Okay, fourth, how does this choice relate to us today? In other words, are we obligated to follow Paul's example in this, or is tent making simply an option or a model that we can choose to follow or not depending on our circumstances? And I think clearly from the text covered in this paper that we're not required or obligated to follow Paul's example in supporting ourselves through both working ministry and a regular secular job at the same time. As noted in the beginning, in the Old Testament, the Levites and the priests were financially supported. We saw that in Numbers 18. Our Lord, during his earthly ministry, was supported. We saw that in Luke 8. And Paul himself is quick to say that he has a right to financial support, even though he did not choose to exercise this right for various means. We saw that in 1 Corinthians and other places. In the pastoral epistles, Paul does not teach that elders have to have outside work. He's not something he talks about. In fact, at least in 1 Timothy, we find that they are to be supported, clearly. And other passages seem to suggest the same thing. I think it's therefore clear that we are not obligated to follow his example in this. That being said, there's much we can learn from his example, as we've already talked about. And I think there are times when the best model would be to follow his practice. So, for example, two modern ministry forms that closely match what Paul was doing. Lose myself in my notes. What Paul was doing in Corinth or Ephesus or Thessalonica are church planters and missionaries. I kind of use those terms interchangeably. Obviously, they're different, but I think they both fit his context, so I've kind of used them both throughout this paper. Practically speaking, new churches in unchurched areas are often not able to support a full-time ministry worker, just practically. There's also a real danger if evangelism and requests for money are mixed. There will be misunderstanding and the gospel might be hindered. So it's best, therefore, in these circumstances to support oneself through either outside financial support or through practicing some kind of a trade. And I think there could also be a place where society is so convinced that people are in it for the money, or if that's such a prevalent issue in the church, that supporting yourself through some outside means might also be the best model to practice. So I think there's times when it's something we should do, though not mandatory. So lastly, almost going a little over the time here, but last thing, I'll make this personal and ask, how does Paul's example relate to my personal ministry goals? Before that, I think it's helpful just to give quick background of what I've done in ministry. So I spent 2 years as a missionary in Nepal, and while there, I robbed churches in America and individuals so I could serve amongst them free of charge. I think this is following Paul's example quite clearly. Sometime later, when living in America, I worked 2 part-time youth pastor jobs at the same time, and I was financially compensated for my work, but nowhere near enough to support myself or my family. So I also had a 3rd job as a laborer, and at times a 4th job. And I think this also fits under Paul's example in a kind of a secondary way. My most recent ministry position was at a Christian ministry serving people who are experiencing homelessness. It was a full-time job, and I was able to support my family from the wages I received. The organization I worked for did not receive financial compensation from the homeless, the people they were directly ministering to for obvious reasons, but was entirely supported through donations. Though this is a parachurch organization and does not strictly fit the scriptural model, I think this falls under what is biblically proper, and kind of a similar train of thought. So, looking to the future, I obviously do not know what God has in store, but I certainly have plans and goals. I'm sure we all do. And, this time of COVID probably changed some of our plans and goals, but We'll see what God gives. It's in his hands. He wasn't taken by surprise by anything. I anticipate that my next job, ministry position, will be at a local church somewhere in America. As we've already seen biblically, an elder or a pastor can and should be compensated for his work. I think that's scriptural. So I think it is also significant that Christian ministers in 21st century America are expected to have a fairly significant degree of higher education, as well as there's a building to manage, and there's a variety of other things that wouldn't necessarily have been true in Paul's context for the first century. So most ministers have to be supported by their ministry positions for these models to work. I just think that's kind of the time we live in. Other plans, I would love to serve again as an overseas missionary at some point in the future, and either partially support myself through online work, passive income, or receive support from churches in America. I think that would be ideal. So we'll see. Again, mind of a man plans his ways. The Lord directs his steps. Either way, one way or the other, I intend to serve the Lord with my life, here, there, or wherever. And this is how I've applied and am applying Paul's example in my life. And hopefully you can pray and think about how you want to apply it to your own. Right? So that's the end of what I got. Hopefully it's been a little bit helpful, a little bit encouraging. I believe there'll be a platform for questions and answers if you have them. Also, if you want to go through, read the text, that might be helpful as well. Yeah, God bless, and see you later.